Daniel Tisch is the president and CEO of the Argyle Group, a national communications firm, and he joins us right here in studio. Thank you for joining us, Daniel.
My pleasure.
All right, so it's interesting because you almost have to keep a running tally of the candidates that are being called out for previous posts that they've made or comments that they've made, and either getting dropped or continuing to run. So maybe break down for me a little bit what you're sort of seeing play out.
Yeah, well, I think what we're seeing is that in this campaign, there have been so many of these behavioral bombshells, right? And I think in some ways, the fact that we're in the social media age has really reset the boundaries, and for the parties, it's rewritten the rules. And part of the challenge is coming up with those rules. So early in the campaign, Mr. Scheer identified some tests, right? He said, okay, we're not going to have a blanket policy, but generally speaking, where the candidate has shown regret, taken responsibility, and apologized, that's okay. But of course, it hasn't been always okay, right? And naturally, it's more nuanced. Depends on the context, depends on the candidate's response, depends on the candidate's track record, and of course, it depends on damage to the party's brand. And that's why you see the Conservatives, for instance, saying, okay, anti-gay candidate, that is toxic to our brand, especially when we need to gain support during these critical last 2 weeks of the campaign. So that's why they took the action they did.
And it's interesting, too, though, because it's not just the brand, the campaign brand or the party brand, so to speak. There's also some of these decisions must also be politically motivated, too. Absolutely. How closely are they keeping an eye on how crucial this particular person is in that riding? And we can talk about Andrew Scheer again here, because we did recently see him drop that candidate in Burnaby North Seymour for making those comments. That's
right. And that's where, of course, they look at the impact on the brand, and they do make a political calculus. They are politicians, and so they're looking. So he's looking at that riding. They're looking at that riding, saying there's very little chances that the Conservatives are going to win Burnaby this particular election. The candidate is toxic to the brand, so she's expendable. You look at Mr. Trudeau's decision in Cape Breton, and that's a riding that I believe, I just checked it before we went on air, I think they won 70+% of the vote last election. That is a key seat for them. And they're banking on the fact that this candidate's done enough in his life and career as a Mi'kmaq historian and leader that he'll be forgiven because he's made an apology.
Now, it's interesting because you contrast that decision perhaps with the move from Liberal leader Justin Trudeau when we're talking about a candidate in Nova Scotia who had some racist, sexist tweets that came out, and he apologized for them. And the Liberal leader,
that's the one I was talking about.
And so the Liberal leader there, when we're talking about his decision, his strategy there, how much of that weighs on the fact that he had to apologize for something too? And so if he has to apologize for something and not step down, can he really then ask someone else to step down, besides the political calculus that you were talking about?
Well, you know, I think he still needs to preserve the authority to be able to do that if it's serious enough. And so I think they're going to continue to look at it case by case. But you're quite right, Arthi, in that I think that at this point, given his own challenges on these issues, and the fact that it's late in the campaign and that there have been so many of these, that we're kind of saturated with these stories. So I think they're banking on the fact that there are 14 days left, that you know, if they can make this a one-day story by saying the guy's apologized and we accept his apology, and then with hope stories of the debate and other matters come along to occupy our attention, they can move on to other things. The risk, I think, would have been it would be a multi-day story if the fellow were removed, and then his community would get angry, and then there'd be a focus on the Prime Minister's behavior. So for them politically, it's definitely an easier path in this particular case.
So we're weighing like community backlash versus other party backlash, because of course the other parties would be critical of the candidates and things that they've said. Now, the other question, I guess, is, and this is something that you've touched on before, when we're seeing such a saturation of these issues come to light during this election cycle, why does it seem that it has been such a challenge vetting all of the candidates this time around? It seems like it has been much more challenging than the previous elections.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's because we're in the social media age, and so now the legacy of stuff that we post online, it's basically forever. It's eternal, right? And so our structure, our political system, and structures of vetting weren't really built to withstand this kind of scrutiny, right? And so this is the new reality. I'm sure that when Justin Trudeau first ran as a candidate, they didn't have anywhere near the level of scrutiny required to dig up that infamous photo from his yearbook, right? And so I think all candidates are going to have to live with this. So the question is, what do you do, right? And obviously proactive disclosure is something that's most likely to help you survive. But secondly, when something is uncovered, is your apology authentic? Is it not conditional? Is it not one of these, I'm sorry if anyone was offended, but do you really show you understand the impact and harm? And finally, what have you done since then? Have you changed? And is there evidence that you've lived a life that's admirable and done some admirable things in your community?
And I guess we'll have to see how it all plays out on Election Day. Thanks so much for your time today, Daniel.
My pleasure, Anthony.